Hi everyone. In today's video, we will add functionality to the buttons that we have in our application. So we'll work on functionality for adding new to-dos, for marking the to-dos as done, and for removing the to-dos. But first we need to start once again with a little bit of setup. So by now you should have installed Node.js. Yeah, you can verify it by going to the console, to the terminal, and saying node-v. And it should display a version that you have. I'm using the 14.17 currently, but this really doesn't matter all that much for us. So now, what you have to do is you have to go, so cd app to go into the app folder, and in the app folder, we'll now say npm init-y. So it will just initialize an npm a package.json file for us. So this file is used by npm to generate or to save all the dependencies that we will install. So now the first thing that we need is Express. And Express is a web server. It will be used to serve content on the HTTP requests. In order to do that, we say npm install Express. And now the Express will be installed. I will quickly skip to the point in time where an Express will be installed for me. Okay, so we have Express now. It looks like everything has been installed successfully. So now what we need to do, or what I like to do, is I like to create a new file. I call it app.js. App.js is let's make sure it's inside the app folder. App.js is I would say a convention, but also what happens very often is people just call it index.js. So this is the main file when our main application will be. Okay, so what we need to do is let's first initialize Express, and let's create an app. Okay, so we have our app, and to start our application, what we need to do is say app.listen, and here let's say 3000 as a port, and then this also can take a callback, and as a callback, what I like to say is something like console.log application started and listening on port 3000, because the 3000 here is the port that we will currently use. Okay, and what you need to do now, because this is really it that you need for the first application, what you need to do is go to the terminal, is say node app.js, and you can see that our application has been started because we have received the message that we have specified here. Well, okay, let's try to do something. So we have specified port 3000. So let's go to local host and then colon 3000. And it says that it cannot get anything at the route, because what the browser has just done is it has sent a GET request to the local host to port 3000. And we currently don't serve anything at this endpoint. It means that we do not, that our application did not answer with any content. So what we need to do now is we need to make our application answer with some sort of content. So in other words, we need to create like an endpoint that will serve the GET request. So to create the endpoint that will serve the content on the request, we need a few things. So first thing we need to set our view engine for the application. And we'll use Ejs. And Ejs is just a templating language that allows us to organize the HTML files dynamically with plain JavaScript. This is how we will be able to, on the one hand side, get data from the database that we'll also set up soon. And based on the results, we'll be able to generate some HTML to show the data to the users. Okay, so in order to set up our view engine, what we need to do is in our app.js file, we need to say app.set, and then we want to set view engine, and we want the view engine to be Ejs. Okay, and that's the first thing done. The second thing that we need to do is, by default, this view engine expects a views folder. So let's create that. And let's move our index.html file to the views folder. And inside the views folder, let's rename the file from index.html to index.ejs. Okay, and what we need to do then is we need to come back to our app file. We need to say app.get, because we are currently creating an endpoint that will serve a request with a get method. So I highly encourage you, if you don't know anything about REST APIs, there's a ton of material online that you can just check out. I'm sure that you will be able to learn that pretty quick. So let's use this get method, and we want to serve the basic route. And then what we need to pass in here is a function. So let's make use of the arrow functions in JavaScript. And this function takes a request and a response. And this, if you will later on try to learn more about how here the express behaves, this is what we will call a middleware function. So this will be a function executed when a request is sent to this route that we have passed here as the first argument. Okay, so what we want to do here for now is we just want to return our file. So let's say return and then response, and now we say dot render, and inside here we say index, because index is the name of the file that we have passed there. Okay, so we save it. And now, if you remember, before we run this application by saying node app.js. And this is completely fine. However, currently, if I wanted to refresh this application, I would need to Ctrl+C if you're on Windows to stop this application and to go node app.js once again, which is completely fine. And if I now refresh our application on the runtime side, we get an error. And why did we get an error? Because we need to now install the Ejs dependency. And if you ever forget how to do that, or if you ever find this, get an error like this, I highly encourage you to just Google npm install Ejs, and then here usually it's the first link. Here you'll have all the information up. So apart from the command that you need to run to install Ejs or any other dependency that will be missing, you'll get also usually some basic examples, some basic usage, so you can get a pretty good idea of how this works. However, what we will do is we will use the express version of Ejs. So if you ever forget how to do that, or if you ever get an error like this, I highly encourage you to just go into Google, say npm install Ejs, and then here you'll be able to usually click the first link and you'll get directly the command. You'll get some basic examples, basic usage. I highly encourage you to do so. Okay, let's go back to our error then. Let's Ctrl+C and let's say npm install or Ejs. Okay, now that our Ejs is installed, let's once again run our application and let's refresh. And as you can see here, our application is up and running. So now instead of having the HTML file open, we have the application running in the localhost environment or in the local host. And let's maybe test some things here. This still doesn't work. No surprise, as we did not implement anything yet here. Okay, I think it's a good milestone that we have just hit. So now we have our application running on localhost. However, that would be a good moment to make a commit, right? Because you should usually make commits when you complete a small part of your work, right? As we just did. But if you take a look on the left-hand side, currently our source control is showing 455 pending changes, and that's not good. You don't want to commit that, and this is what happens basically every time that you work with NPM, because if you take a look here on the left-hand side, we have this node modules, gigantic folder created. And it is a folder that stores our dependencies for our application. And there is an ongoing debate if you should commit this folder to your version control, but I think that you don't have to, because you can usually recreate this folder. And how we can exclude the node modules folder very easily for our version control is if we go ahead here and create a new file, and we call it git ignore. Make sure it's in the main repository, so in the main directory, sorry. So not in the app folder, but in the main directory. And here, if you just say node modules, and save it, you can immediately see that the name of the folder has become gray and that we no longer have the 455 pending changes. Instead, we have 6. And okay, let's make use of this, and let's say git add, and let's say git commit. Oops, git commit. Let's say git commit. I had to change the keyboard very quickly. And let's say app is now serving get requests. Okay, and let's push. We could also once again use the integration here. So we will just click around instead of executing few commands. Okay, now we have that. The next thing that we will need is we'll need to provide functionality for the buttons. That's what we wanted to do. And to do that, we will need to set up the database, because we need to store these to-dos somewhere, so they don't disappear every time you refresh the page. Okay, and right now you should already have Postgres installed. And I believe by default, Postgres comes with something called PSQL. So this is just an SQL shell that allows you to connect to the database. And by default, it will run on localhost. Database will be called Postgres, port will be the 5432, username will be Postgres, and password for the user will be Postgres also. Here I just use a different one. And I highly encourage you to do so also. So for now, for playing around using the Postgres super user that has all the privileges in the database, it's fine. But for production, we will definitely then create at least one user with limited privileges. That's a tricky word, so that we don't run into any security issues here. And right now, by the way, we are connected to our database. So here what we can do is we can create a table. And now we need a table that will store our to-dos. So we need to store all the information that we need to display this page that we see right here. So let's do that. Let's say create table. And let's give it a name, to-dos, open and close parentheses, and inside the parentheses, let's define a few columns. So let's give it some kind of ID that will uniquely identify the to-do. Let's maybe make it a primary key so that we also get an index on it. Let's define also some text column. As text is a data type, I take the text, so the column name in parentheses. Let's add some boolean, so done flag, So done will be true or false if a to-do is done or not. And by default, let's set it to false. Of course, when you add a to-do, you always have it as not done first. And then what I like to do is to add some kind of timestamp which says when a row has been added. And so just so that we don't need to care about adding timestamps in JavaScript because it's kind of tricky, we can make the data, we can make default now. We can just use the Postgres now function and it will generate the timestamp at which the row has been added. Okay, let's place a semicolon at the end. Let's hit enter and we can see that the table has been created. Let's maybe try to select something from it. Select star from to-dos. And as expected, we get nothing, but we can see the 4 columns that our table currently has. Okay, what we can do now is let's try to insert some basic maybe dummy data. Let's write a few inserts. So insert into to-dos. Let's go ID text. And then let's say values. And let's say ID will be 1. It's a text, so I take it in the single quotation mark. And then let's say write HTML. Okay, let's put a semicolon at the end. Let's hit enter. Okay, now let's try to repeat our select. And now we can see that we have successfully inserted the row. Moreover, we can see that the done has been set to false by default and that the timestamp here was generated according to our current timestamp. Okay, but I guess we should make a small remark here. What we are doing currently, so basically the whole topic of how our application is cooperating with the database. There are many packages called ORMs, so Object Relational Mappers, that allow us to improve this transition, that to a certain degree automatize this, right? What would happen then is instead of us going to this console right here, we would be just creating, let's say, classes or functions, depending on the ORM that you choose, and it would be doing all the work underneath. So it would, on the one hand side, handle the data manipulation language, meaning the inserts, deletes, selects, and so on, but it would also handle all the data definition language. So if we make a change to a column, if we create a table, it would apply all the changes for you. And now we'll not use an ORM in these tutorials because I want to show you how it works. And I also think that our application is very simple, therefore you just don't need it. And it's better, in my opinion, to understand the basics and really understand how it works at the very beginning and then move on to the ORMs. And then you can decide for yourself if you want to use them, if you don't want to use them, but you'll be able to make an informed decision. Okay, saying that, we still want to automatize our work. We don't want to go in here and we don't want to write these statements very often. Therefore, for now, I will close it. And what I will do is, because instead of using the terminal we have just had open, we can use our terminal right here in Visual Studio Code. What you have to do is just say psql, and you will get the similar prompt that you did get when we opened the psql, so the SQL shell. And it asks you for a password. I will right now hit Ctrl+C to abort that, because what I need to say is psql-u to give it a user, and then say that I want to log in with the Postgres user. And now I can connect with a Postgres user. I will make that a little bit bigger. And let's now try to do select star from to-dos. Let's see if this is the same database. And indeed, we can see the to-do. One important information here. In order to be able to use the psql command, let's maybe I'll Ctrl+C, psql. You need to add psql to your path. In other words, you need to add it to the path environmental variable. Now you can do it relatively easily. I'll currently not show you because I have some personal information in these environmental variables, but I'm sure you can very easily find a guide online how you do that. Basically, you go here and you say environment variables, you go in here, and then you hit environment variables. You will find like a list with path environment variable. Then you go into the path and you add the path to the Postgres bin file. So I can just show you how this path looks for me. Let me look for it very quick. So for me, by default, right, I can show you the environment variable. So by default, it will be installed here. So basically, you need to put the path to this bin folder in here, to the path, to the variable called path. Okay, and then you'll be able to use psql. And why that's important is because automatization is good, right? And we don't want to be connecting to any unnecessary shells and executing something manual. What I like to do is I like to create a file if I'm not using an ORM, which I'll call ddl.sql. So data definition language.sql. There will not only be data definition language statements, however, this is just naming. And let's here repeat what we did in the shell very quick, right? So let's say, create table, to-dos, and here I can create new lines, no problem. Let's create once again ID varchar, it will be a primary key. Let's create a text column, that will be a text. Let's create a done, which will be a boolean, and by default it will be false. And let's create other DDTM timestamp default now. Okay, we should be fine. Let's put a semicolon at the end. Let's save this file. And now what we can do is we can say psql-u postgres -f ddl.sql. And what this will do, right after we give our password here, it will execute the file inside this SQL shell. And we get the output of this, and unfortunately we get an error because, and rightfully so, the relation to-dos, so in other words, the table to-dos already exists. This is why what I like to do is I like to place, for testing purposes, here a drop table statement, drop table to-dos. However, a nice feature of Postgres is that you can say drop table if exists. Therefore, if we run this for the first time in a database, this will not crash because otherwise it would return an error if the to-dos did not exist and we tried to drop it. In this way, this will work just fine. Let's try to repeat it and check if it works. And indeed, we can see that the table has been dropped and the table has been created once again. However, what's the problem currently is that right now we have lost our testing data. So we have lost the one row that we had. Let's try to recreate it. Insert into to-dos, ID text, values. Let's once again give it an ID of 1, and let's say write HTML. Okay, and let's save that, and let's maybe create a second one. Why not? Here we put 2, and we don't want to be writing HTML, or maybe we want to be writing, but we want to be writing CSS. Okay, let's once again execute the file. And you can see that the table has been dropped, it has been created once again, and 2 rows were inserted, and that's very good. Okay, so now we have our database set up. So next step that we need to do is we need to somehow retrieve the results here so that later on we can pass them to our index .html. So it used to be .html, currently it's .ejs, and you will see the difference in a second. So we need to have some kind of way of retrieving the results here, and let's do that then. So what we need to connect to the database, or rather you can use many different packages. However, what we'll need is a package called PG. So you can just go in here, as I said, once again, npm.js.com. You get this installation command, which is super simple, but you also get support and you get some basic examples if you go into the homepage, into the repositories here, so that you just can learn the basics. What you need to do in order to do that, let's go inside our app folder and let's say npm install pg. And it will install very quick. And so now what we can do is let's just say const and let's directly get a class, a class called client from, and now we require pg. Okay. What I like to do is place white space here and here. Okay. So now what we can do is we can create a new client. So the client will be our connection to the database. And now we need to pass in some parameters. So with the parameters, what you want to do is you really want to save them as environmental variables. So you do that in the same way that you actually added the bin folder, so the Postgres bin folder, to the path environmental variable. So you go into the menu here, you say environment variables. You go into the environment variables, and then you, instead of adding values to an existing one, you'll be just adding new environment variables. By the way, after you add them, you need to restart Visual Studio Code so that they have effect. And what we'll do here is we will now pass all the connection details that we need for our application to be able to connect to the database using the environment variables. And what we need to do is we need to pass in a user. And now in JavaScript, to refer to a macro variable, you say process.env dot, and then the macro variable name. So what I already have defined is Postgres RW user. And here you can see the RW in my case stands for read write user. For now, it's just the same user, but later on when you go to production or to production-like environment, we'll just replace this user with a different user, right? So for now, under this macro variable, I have the one super user. However, we will change that later. Okay. We also need a host. So say process.env.postgres host. So the user is the name of our user. The host is, currently it's localhost. What we need to do, we need to pass in here is also a database. Process.env.postgres database. And the Postgres database. And then what you also need is a password for the user, of course. So process.env, oops, here, Postgres RW, but not user, but password. Of course, you need to define the values to the ones that you have used during the installation or to the default ones, right? So then the user will be Postgres, host will be localhost, the database name will be Postgres, password will be Postgres. And what you also need, or I think, I currently don't remember if it has a default or not, process.env.postgres port. I like to also set the port because sometimes on production you want to change it, especially if you plan to run multiple Postgres databases. What you can also do always. Okay, and we now have all the necessary information for our client to connect to the database. So as you can see, these are all the information that we also had to provide when using our shell. And now what we can do is we can use a client method which says connect. And this will just connect to our database. And now what I like to do is I like to write a short query which says connect, which creates a response object and saves the response object, and says client.query. And here we can say select, and once again we can use the now function. So we use our client object, we use a query method of this object, and we send this query to the database. So it is just as if we now open the shell and wrote select now. It will return us the current timestamp. And what we want to do with the timestamp, is after the promise that client.query returns is resolved, we want to, let's pass in the response object here, and let's maybe just console log it, saying connected to the DB. That's maybe the best way to style it. Connected to the DB, and say then plus response dot. And now you need to know a little bit how the response object looks like. Dot rows 0, because the response object has a rows key, and which is an array, and in our case it will just return one row. So we want to take the first row and we want to take the now value. So now is the name of the column for the result set. Okay, now this all looks good. Let's move it right here and we should be fine. So currently what should happen is if we now run this piece of code, it should connect to the database and display a maybe let's say connected, should display the connected to the DB message and the current timestamp. And the problem is, or not the problem, we could as well always do node app.js. It would work just fine. Let's maybe actually check this out. And indeed we can see our first message that the application has been started and listening on port 3000, and that it has connected to the DB. By the way, what is interesting is now you can see the asynchronous code in action, because even though we have it earlier in the code, it is displayed later, and it is because of this, right? Because here a promise is returned and it takes a while for the promise to be resolved. Even though it's very fast because the database is running on our local host, it still requires some time to set up the connection. However, currently, these are very good news because we have a connection to our database that is working, and let's maybe shortly test that. But before we do that, I would like to tell you one more thing. And it is that actually whenever we make a change, we now must stop our application and run node app.js once again to start it. What we can do is something that is that comes with Node, and it's nodemon. And if you say instead of node app.js, nodemon app.js, it will now automatically refresh every time we make a change. So let's make a change here. Let's save, and you can see that it has automatically restarted. Okay, that's very nice. Now we supposedly know that we have connected to the database, but let's confirm that. So if you remember, here we have added the 2 testing rows. Let's currently try to retrieve them inside our JavaScript code. In order to do that, I will use the async await syntax and not the then syntax. I like it much more to deal with the promises. Okay, in order to do that, what we can do is we can once again utilize the arrow functions. Oops, not page transition event. I want to open some parentheses, and inside these parentheses, we want to create a response object that will be equal to client.query once again, and this time we want to select star from to-dos. By the way, you usually don't want to say select star, you want to say select and then give it a list of columns. And here let's just print the results. Now in order to, we just want to call this function, we need to do this and this, and once again parentheses, And here in JavaScript, so probably as you've already noticed, I don't use the semicolons. I think they are not necessary, and they are not necessary. However, this is one place where these are necessary. If I saved this now, this would crash, and it would say that then it's not a function, because how it treats it currently is that we want to call this function. We want to treat then as a function and call it with these as parameters inside. Therefore, here we need a semicolon. And this works just fine. And what I want to show you is because, as you can see here, now we have this object here in the results. Let's make it a little bit bigger. And you can already see that the data we have here corresponds to what we have here in the ddl.sql. So these are exactly our testing rows, right? So on top of the 1, the 2, and the write HTML and write CSS, and we can see the false, we can see the timestamp, which is all good. But I wanted to shortly show you the object that we get when we make a query with the PG. What you can see here is what type of command was executed, how many rows were retrieved, and also what is useful for us is exactly this rows key, right? So in the rows key, as I already told you, we have an array, and inside this array we have objects which represent our rows. So this is why precisely here we did response objects, and then we used the rows key. We took the first row and we selected the now value. So I think this is very important to keep in your mind how this object looks like. There are also other values here. Of course, to be honest, I'm not even 100% sure what they mean, but I'm sure you can look it up. And these are described, and these can be useful for you. Okay, so for now, this is it. So we have successfully set up a connection to the database. Now it works. We have added the test data. So now what we will do is we will configure or we will make the query to what we already did here, basically, to return all the to-dos. And then we will try to put the results on our web application. In order to do that, let's start by removing this part. We will no longer need that. Let's save. And you can see our application restarted by itself. So the node one is working great. Let's go back to our application. Let's also refresh this. So you can see it's still working. Okay, so what we need to do now? We need to make use of what we already have here. What we'll do is we'll use our client.query as we did just before to retrieve our to-dos. So let's say const response, and let's say client.query, and let's say select ID done or text. Let's put in double mark and to-dos from to-dos. Sorry, it's of course not called to-dos. We called it, let's check it, done. Okay, done. And we have it now. We forgot one more thing, which is the await here. And if we put the await here, we need to make this function asynchronous, of course. But what is also missing is something that you should always do. If you use async await code, you should put that into a try and catch blocks. That's also very useful in web applications because, so in web applications, you don't want your client to see the error. So no matter the error, you want to gracefully handle it and then redirect your user, maybe display some kind of message to your user that something went wrong. But you always want to try to catch the errors. So let's do this. And if we catch an error, let's for now just display this error in a console. We'll get back to it later on when we will be working on displaying some information to our users, but this is still a good way to go before us. Okay, and So now we have this RESP object, and here I made a slight mistake because we need this RESP object to be defined outside of this try catch block so that we can later on use it right here. Here you need to pass an object, and inside this object you can just say, let's say to-dos will be our RESP object, and, or if you remember the structure of our response, what we need to do is, instead of saying passing here the whole RESP object, which we could do, but it really doesn't make much sense, we need to pass the rows of this. And then this means that we'll pass the array that we have right here. Okay. This is fine. Let's maybe save it right here. Our application should have, if I save it, refreshes. Let's refresh this on the right hand side. So far nothing changed, and this is good. So next step, we need to go into the index.ejs, and we need to actually use the variable that we have just provided to this view, because by specifying this following syntax, we can now use this RESP or this to-dos variable inside our view. And how do you do that? So as I said, Ejs is basically allowing us to use JavaScript to generate this HTML. So now let's find the place where we are actually generating the list of to-dos. So it's like here. And if you install an extension which is called Ejs language support, I believe it should give you access to the snippets. So if you just hit greater than, it will give you an access to a list of snippets. And what we want to select is we want to select array.forEach element. Okay, and now what we can just do is we can say here to-dos, right? Because to-dos is an array. And it will take an element, and what we want to do for each element. We want to take this, let's align it properly, and we still keep the same class, but here we don't want to say write HTML, we want to say, and this is how you display a value, right? You say greater than, %, and then equals. You say element dot, and then you access it just as a JavaScript object, and there we have text, I believe. So you say that just element dot text. Okay, let's save it now, and let's refresh it on the right hand side. And what you can see is that we have something more than we had. Let's now remove the two testing rows that we have here. One more. Okay. Maybe let's also remove the right JavaScript. Let's save the index.js and let's refresh it on the right hand side. And voila, you can see that we now only have 2 left. Okay, but that's not only it still may have been some kind of leftover after what we did. So now let's try to go into our DDL.SQL. Let's try to insert another to-do here. Let's this time say something different. First, let's give it a unique ID, as we have a primary key here defined. And let's say our unique to-do. Let's save it. What we need to do, so I will start on our console now, so that we are able to execute this. DDL.SQL. Once again, the password. Okay, drop table, create table, 3 inserts. Fantastic. And let's now go ahead and refresh the website. And voila, as you can see, here we have our new to-do. So basically it means that our integration is working. So now we have an endpoint that serves the GET request and that responds to the GET request with the automatically or dynamically generated HTML web page. And I think that's a very good moment to end the episode. But before we do that, let's very quickly, maybe this time using the integration right here, let's commit, or let's push all the changes to the repository. So let's write a commit message. Database integration done. Let's hit Ctrl plus Enter, and I'm publishing a new branch that will contain all the contents at a point in time that we finished episode 3. Okay, for now, thank you very much for watching, and in the next episode we will finally get to getting some functionality added to those buttons. So to the add button, to the delete, and to the buttons that set these to-dos to done.